Funkadelic have been part of my musical life since 1996, when I started collecting the individual CDs that had been reissued at the time. And their albums were spread across two labels. There were the Westbound albums, and there were the Capitol label albums. And both of them had a different flavor, and that's very common regarding anything involving George Clinton and the circle of P-Funk musicians that he's worked with. And recently, in the last 4 or 5 years or so, I've been talking with my friend Henrique Hopkins, and we actually talked about this just before I did this video, about the nature of Funkadelic's first 3 or 4 Westbound albums. And recently, through sales and through pre-owned copies, I managed to get a hold of a couple of the Four Men with Beards reissues. And both of them are very different. But what I'm going to do is review these albums, and I'm going to look through the vinyl and show different aspects of them, and give you a little history behind these particular records. And there's going to be a central framework for this. And that was just how much funk was there in Funkadelic in the beginning. And that goes with the fact that, Funkadelic came out of Detroit and New Jersey. George Clinton being from Jersey and a lot of the P-Funk people being from Detroit, and them all merging together out of the Motown scene from the Parliaments. The original vocal group that George Clinton had, of course, with Calvin Simon, Grady Thomas, and Fuzzy Haskins. And what happened was they had a backup group called the Funkadelics. And, they eventually all kind of merged together into Funkadelic. And that included the vocalist Ray Davis, guitarist Tall Ross, Bernie Worrell, the late Bernie Worrell, keyboard giant organ player at the time, Tiki Fullwood on drums, and Billy Bass Nelson, of course, the bass player. And then, of course, you had the late, great Eddie Hazel on guitar. And, when I first listened to these albums, I didn't really have a good context as a teenager for either funk or rock. But, listening to these albums now on vinyl, I realized something about them. And I'm going to start with this album from 1970. And, of course, the title is Free Your Mind. That's just the written word. It does not bear repeating. It says it for itself. And, of course, it's a gatefold. It's a naked black woman descending into the heaven. And this album, lyrically, when I listen to it, it subverts a lot of Bible verses. It talks about the kingdom of heaven is within on the title track, which is by far the longest track on the actual album. Goes on for just a little over 10 minutes. And, there's that, Friday Night, August the 14th, Funky Dollar Bill, which is basically a song about, the troubles that junkies and drug dealers can go through trying to get money, and, the intricacies of that. And also, I Want to Know If It's Good to You. And to be honest, these 4 songs, and this is the point Henrique and I were making, these are acid rock songs. They're played in a funky way, but there's a big difference between funk music as a genre and playing something funky. Led Zeppelin played a lot of things that were done in a funky way. Jimi Hendrix played a lot of things in a funky way. And this album, you can tell, is very much inspired by Hendrix. The story goes that this album was recorded in a day or so, and the idea was that George wanted to do an album where they were all tripping on acid while they were doing it. So this is definitely acid rock in its purest form. Now, there are vocals on here that separate it from a lot of, of the psychedelic rock that's out there, save for some of Jimi Hendrix's later releases. Martha Reeves is on this album, uncredited, and, Thelma Hopkins and Joyce Vincent, who were from Tony Orlando's Dawn, are also singing background on Friday night, August the 14th. So, you have this interesting convergence of musicians that don't even seem to be of the same genres in particular coming together for this really, actually quite raggedy and wild presentation. This was sort of, I would say, the continuation after Hendrix of, the black rock scene. We had Living Color later, and Mother's Finest come along, a little bit later in the 70s, but this was really the start of the whole black rock thing. It's definitely, this album's from July of 1970, the original album, but it definitely comes out of a 60s mentality. You have Eulogy in Light, which is all a backwards mass song, where it's a tape loop, and George is doing a recitation over it, and he changes again and subverts Bible verses, talking about, as I walk through the shadow of poverty. There's a lot of interesting references on here. And as far as I'm concerned, Some More is a flat-out blues piece, kind of a rhythm and blues piece in the purest sense of the word. The original album actually had a different cover. This was in white up here, and this was on the bottom in brown, and it was a slightly different version of that picture. There's Funkadelic at that particular time. That's Eddie Hazel in the front. Now this is on plain black vinyl with a 4-min on with Beard's label, so I don't think I need to show you that vinyl. And that's the story of Free Your Mind. Now, when we come to 1971, the whole equation changes, you see, because we have Maggot Brain. Now, this was actually one of the last Funkadelic albums I bought, period. And I bought it on CD. But I recently got this vinyl. This was pre-owned. Free Your Mind was actually on sale. And this album has a gatefold. My CD didn't have. Now, it has liner notes here from the Process Church of the Final Judgment, which George Clinton briefly discussed his involvement with in his autobiography. And it's taken from process number 5 on fear. Now, you can read that. I don't know how much information there is in the Process Church of the Final Judgment. There's a maggot up there. And you see fear written here. This album takes an altogether different approach than the last album. First of all, you have Maggot Brain, which is pretty much straight up acid rock. It's Eddie Hazel's Time to Shine. And George Clinton, of course, does that famous narration about Mother Earth is pregnant again, and y'all know you've knocked her up, and so on and so forth. Now, can you get to that? Has a totally different vibe to it. This song, has an acoustic guitar and everything, and there's more of a gospel flavor to it, and it has some terrific lyrics, as a lot of these particular songs do, from Funkadelic as they evolved. And, Henrique and I have discussed that one of the funkiest things Funkadelic did, where their sound kind of all came together, was on the song Hit It and Quit It. Now, this is a very blues-oriented jam, but between those female vocals and just the rhythm of it, it's getting into a harder, soulful funk sound. Now, in that same spirit, You and Your Folks, Me and My Folks is, one of my favorites on this album. It basically deals with the idea of, people in poor communities uniting with each other despite cultural, racial differences against oppression, and it's a really good tune. Super Stupid, again, goes straight for the acid rock vibe, and the whole idea is of a junkie who buys the wrong drug and gets into some psychological trouble with that. Now, Fuzzy Haskins wrote Back in Our Minds, which again is more of a funky flavored number with this little trampoline effect that I like. And the final song on the album is actually this 9-minute Latin funk rock noise jam called Wars of Armageddon, which is nothing like anything I've ever heard Funkadelic do before. Now, this album, it's the last one, I believe, with Eddie Hazel, and it has a different vibe to it. The songs are getting more clearly defined, and, there's more of a soulful vibe to it in the funk, and, the presentation is, still that wild and raggedy sensibility, but, the acid rock is disappearing, and the production is becoming much, much, much sharper, and you can hear Funkadelic really evolving on this album from their acid-oriented and rock-oriented beginnings into the more funk side of Funkadelic. So between these two albums, they're both important transitions as far as Funkadelic are concerned. So that, at the end of the day, is my 2 cents on these particular albums by Funkadelic. Now, as Henrique and I have also discussed, I'm not sure if a lot of people who are seriously into P-Funk actually realize how the Ohio Players in the Junie Morrison era lineup on the Westbound label also during this time in the early 70s, they had a stronger jazz background to begin with. That was their whole thing, was a jazzier background. And we were discussing, Henrique and I, about how bands like the Crusaders and jazz-oriented groups actually got into the funk much more seriously and knew how to play it cleanly, where, a lot of rock acts went for playing in a dirty, grimy, funky manner rather than having a clean funk production, which is more James Brown did. And George Clinton was really developing his sound with Funkadelic on these albums and developing into the funky approach rather than the funky way of playing. And these are definitely more, a funky attitude than they are funky music, especially this album. But on this one, the actual funk music is actually starting to happen. So this is basically the evolutionary coil of P-Funk and Funkadelic in general. And if you don't have them on CD and you want to have them on vinyl, I strongly encourage you to seek both of these albums out. This and this. Especially Maggot Brain, because that has a lot of acclaim, and it is all very much true. This is an album you really need to hear Funkadelic's evolution. But, this is an important album, too, because it represents their earlier period. And their first album came earlier in the year than this, and that's a whole other conversation. Each Funkadelic album is its own conversation. But this is the conversation of these two albums, and enjoy your music, feel your funky emotions, and I'll see you next time. Peace.